Detective James Harrison had seen plenty in his 15 years on the force. Enough to know when something felt wrong and enough to trust that feeling in his gut. It was a cold November evening when the radio crackled to life in his patrol car. A neighbor had called about screaming coming from one of the apartments on Riverside Street. Nothing unusual about that. Domestic disputes, arguments, the occasional party gone wrong. Just another Tuesday night in the city. James pulled up to the building around 8:30. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He'd been to this building before, knew the layout, knew some of the faces. It was one of those old apartment complexes where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. The kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar and also knew exactly when you came home late. A woman in her 60s met him at the entrance, Mrs. Patterson from the second floor. She was wringing her hands, her face pale under the dim hallway lights. "It's apartment 4B, she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I heard terrible screaming about 20 minutes ago. Then it just stopped. Everything went quiet. Too quiet, you know? I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. I got scared." James nodded, keeping his expression calm. People got scared easily, and half the time these calls turned out to be nothing. A loud movie. A heated argument that had already blown over. But you never knew. That was the thing about this job. You never really knew until you walked through that door. He climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his hand resting naturally on his belt. The hallway was silent except for the buzz of fluorescent lights and a television playing somewhere behind closed doors. When he reached apartment 4B, he noticed immediately that something was off. The door wasn't closed all the way. It sat slightly open, maybe an inch or two, and when he looked closer, he could see that the lock had been damaged. Fresh scratches marked the metal around the doorframe. "Police!" James called out, pushing the door open slowly. "Anyone home?" No answer. The apartment was small. He could see most of it from the doorway. Living room straight ahead with a worn couch and a television that was turned off. Kitchen to the right. Hallway to the left, probably leading to the bedroom and bathroom. Everything looked normal at first glance. A child's backpack sat by the couch. Drawings were stuck to the refrigerator with magnets. A half-empty cup of coffee sat on the counter. Then he saw her. A young woman lay on the kitchen floor, completely still. James felt his heart rate spike as he moved quickly across the room, already reaching for his radio. She was on her side, one arm stretched out like she'd been reaching for something. There was blood. Not a lot, but enough. A wound on the side of her head near her temple. James checked for a pulse, already knowing what he would find. Nothing. He was reaching for his radio when he heard it. A small sound, barely audible. A whimper. James turned and saw her then. A little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sitting in the corner between the refrigerator and the wall. She had pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. Her eyes were wide, staring at nothing, and she was rocking slightly back and forth. "Hey there," James said softly, keeping his distance. He'd been trained for this, but training never quite prepared you for the real thing. "My name is James. I'm a police officer. You're safe now, okay? Nobody's going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond, didn't even look at him, just kept rocking, her small body trembling. James called it in. Within minutes, the apartment was filled with people. Other officers, paramedics, crime scene investigators. The building's residents gathered in the hallway, whispering among themselves, trying to see what was happening. James stayed with the girl until a victim advocate arrived. Someone trained to handle traumatized children. Even then, the girl wouldn't speak. Wouldn't say a single word about what she'd seen. The victim was identified as Helen Wright, 28 years old, single mother. She'd lived in the apartment for 3 years, worked as a nurse at the community hospital. Everyone in the building said the same thing. She was kind, quiet, always smiled when you passed her in the hallway. The kind of person who remembered your name and asked how your day was going. Her daughter was named Lily, 6 years old, 1st grade. The aunt was being contacted in another state. James walked through the apartment again, this time looking at everything with investigator eyes instead of first responder eyes. The forced entry was clear. Someone had broken in. There were signs of a struggle. A chair knocked over. Items scattered near where Helen had fallen. It looked like she'd tried to fight back. The television and laptop were still there, so probably not a robbery. At least not primarily. Then someone mentioned the ex-boyfriend. She had a restraining order against him, one of the neighbors told the officers. Guy named Tommy Ross. Used to come around here making a scene. Security had to escort him out a few times. Last time was maybe 2 weeks ago. She was scared of him, you could tell. James felt that familiar click in his brain, the pieces starting to come together. The forced entry. The violence. The ex-boyfriend with a history. He'd worked enough of these cases to know the pattern. Domestic situations that escalated. Men who couldn't let go. Women who paid the price for trying to move on with their lives. They pulled Tommy Ross's record. Multiple arrests for assault. Violation of the restraining order just 14 days earlier. He'd been warned to stay away from Helen, told that next time he'd go to jail. Apparently he hadn't listened. Security footage from the building showed someone matching Tommy's description entering the building that evening around 7:45. The timestamp was right. The build was right. The baseball cap pulled low over his face was exactly the kind of thing someone would wear if they didn't want to be identified but weren't quite smart enough to avoid the cameras altogether. By midnight, James was certain they had their man. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The motive was there. The opportunity was there. The means were there. It was textbook. Open and shut. They picked up Tommy Ross at his apartment the next morning. He denied everything, of course. They always did. Claimed he'd only been at the building to visit a friend on the second floor. Said he never went near Helen's apartment. Said he was trying to respect the restraining order, trying to move on with his life. James didn't believe a word of it. He'd heard too many lies over the years, seen too many guilty men playing innocent. The evidence spoke louder than words, and the evidence was clear. Little Lily still hadn't said anything. The trauma had locked her voice away somewhere deep inside. Maybe one day she'd be ready to talk about what she'd witnessed. Maybe not. Either way, James was determined to make sure justice was served for her, mother. He had no idea that his certainty would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The trial started 6 months after that November night. James had testified in court before dozens of times, but this one felt different. Maybe because he'd been first on the scene. Maybe because he couldn't stop thinking about little Lily sitting in that corner, silent and shaking. Maybe because he was so absolutely certain they had the right guy. The courtroom was packed. Helen's family sat in the front row on the left side. Her sister clutched a framed photograph of Helen, the kind you'd see at a funeral. On the right side, Tommy Ross sat at the defense table in a suit that looked borrowed. His public defender, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, shuffled through papers with the energy of someone who'd already worked 3 cases that week. James watched from the back until they called him to testify. He'd gone over his notes 100 times, made sure every detail was locked in his memory. The prosecutor, a sharp guy named David Chen, walked him through the night of the incident step by step. Detective Harrison, can you describe what you found when you entered the apartment? James spoke clearly, keeping his emotions in check like he'd been trained. He described the forced entry, the position of Helen's body, the evidence of a struggle. He explained how he'd found Lily, how she'd been too traumatized to speak. He laid out the timeline, the security footage, Tommy's history with Helen. And based on your 15 years of experience in law enforcement, what conclusion did you draw? That Tommy Ross broke into Helen Wright's apartment? They had an altercation and he killed her. Either intentionally or in a moment of rage. The evidence supported that conclusion. The defense attorney cross-examined him, but she didn't have much to work with. She tried to poke holes in the timeline, suggested the security footage wasn't clear enough to definitively identify her client, pointed out that no murder weapon had been recovered, that Helen's head injury could have been from falling during the struggle rather than a deliberate attack. James kept his answers short and professional. The evidence spoke for itself. Tommy had motive. He'd violated the restraining order before. He'd been at the building that night. The door had been forced open. Helen was dead. What other explanation made sense? Tommy took the stand in his own defense, which his lawyer had probably advised against. He looked nervous, kept fidgeting with his hands. His story was that he'd gone to the building to see a friend named Carlos who lived on the second floor. Said they'd watched a basketball game together, had a few beers, and he'd left around 8:30. He swore he never went to the 4th floor, never saw Helen, didn't even know she was dead until the police showed up at his door the next morning. The prosecutor tore him apart. Why hadn't he mentioned this Carlos character when he was first questioned? Why were the timestamps slightly off from what he was claiming? If he was trying so hard to follow the restraining order, Why risk going to the same building where Helen lived? Tommy stumbled over his answers, got defensive. At one point he raised his voice, which didn't help his case at all. James could see the jury watching him, reading his body language, making their judgments. An angry man with a history of violence barely keeping it together on the stand. It didn't look good. Carlos did testify that Tommy had been at his apartment that evening, but his timeline was fuzzy. He'd had quite a bit to drink that night, he admitted. Couldn't say exactly when Tommy had arrived or left. The prosecutor suggested that Carlos was covering for his friend, or that Tommy could have made a quick trip upstairs to the 4th floor without Carlos knowing. The prosecution also called Helen's co-workers from the hospital. They testified about how scared she'd been of Tommy, how she'd changed her schedule to avoid running into him, how she'd confided that she was afraid he might do something crazy. One nurse broke down crying on the stand, talking about how Helen had been worried about Lily's safety. Helen's sister gave victim impact testimony. Talked about what a wonderful mother Helen had been, how she'd worked double shifts to give Lily a good life, how she'd been planning to move to a different city to get away from Tommy, had been saving up money, had been so close to starting over. The jury listened with sympathetic faces. Several people in the courtroom were crying. Tommy's lawyer did her best. She was overworked, underpaid, handling too many cases at once, but she tried. She argued reasonable doubt, pointed out that no forensic evidence directly tied Tommy to the crime scene. No fingerprints on the door. No DNA. No witnesses who actually saw him on the 4th floor. The security footage showed someone who looked like Tommy, but was it definitely him? Could they be certain beyond a reasonable doubt? But the pieces fit too well together. The history of violence, the restraining order violation, the presence in the building at the right time, the forced entry that suggested someone who knew the victim, who was angry, who wasn't thinking straight. The jury didn't need DNA or fingerprints when the circumstantial evidence painted such a clear picture. James attended every day of the trial, sat through every testimony, watched the jury's faces as they absorbed the evidence. He developed an instinct over the years for how these things would go, and he felt confident. They had their case. They had their evidence. Justice would be served. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, not long for a murder trial. When they came back, the foreman stood and read the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Helen's sister sobbed with relief. Tommy's mother let out a wail from the back row. Tommy himself just sat there staring straight ahead, shaking his head slowly back and forth. "I didn't do it," he said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I didn't do it." But nobody was listening anymore. The judge banged his gavel, called for order. 3 weeks later, at sentencing, Tommy received 25 years to life. He maintained his innocence right up until the moment they led him away in chains. He looked directly at James as he passed, and James met his gaze without flinching. He'd done his job. He'd put a killer behind bars. He'd gotten justice for Helen and for Lily. James attended the sentencing with several other officers from his precinct. Afterward, Helen's sister approached him outside the courthouse. She hugged him, thanked him through tears, told him he'd given them closure, said that Helen could rest in peace now, that Lily could grow up knowing her mother's killer was locked away. James accepted her gratitude with a humble nod. It was what he'd signed up for, what he'd spent 15 years doing, finding the truth, following the evidence, making sure the guilty paid for their crimes. He went back to work the next week. New cases piled up on his desk. Life moved forward the way it always did. The case file on Helen Wright went into the archives. Tommy Ross became just another name on a list of convictions. James received a commendation from the chief for his thorough work on the case. And Lily went to live with her aunt in another state, still silent, still carrying the weight of that November night. James thought about her sometimes. Hoped she was getting help. Hoped she'd find her voice again someday. He had no way of knowing that 8 years later, everything he believed about that night would come crashing down around him. 8 years passed like water under a bridge. James made detective sergeant. Got married. Bought a house in the suburbs. The job kept him busy. Always another case, always another crime to solve. Some stuck with you longer than others. But eventually they all became files in the archive. That was how you survived this work. You did your job, you moved forward, you didn't let the past drag you down. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March when everything started to unravel. James had been assigned to review some cold cases, looking for any that might benefit from new forensic technology. DNA analysis had come a long way in the past decade. Cases that had gone nowhere years ago sometimes cracked wide open with a fresh look. He was down in the basement archive room, surrounded by boxes and file cabinets that smelled like old paper and dust. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. It was quiet down there, almost peaceful in a weird way. Just him and decades worth of unsolved mysteries. He wasn't looking for Helen Wright's file. Had no reason to. That case was solved, closed, done. But he found it anyway, purely by accident. He'd been pulling files from late 2016 and early 2017, looking for a series of burglaries that had gone cold. One of the boxes had files mixed up, misfiled by someone who'd been in a hurry. And there it was. Helen's case tucked between two unrelated investigations. James almost put it back without opening it. Almost. But something made him pause. Maybe curiosity, maybe just the memory of that night, of finding Lily in the corner, of feeling so certain about everything. He pulled the file out and flipped it open. The photos were still hard to look at. Helen on the kitchen floor, the broken door lock, the scattered items showing signs of struggle. He'd seen these images 100 times during the investigation and trial, but they still carried weight. Still reminded him why he did this job. He was about to close the file when something caught his eye. A supplementary report he didn't remember reading before. It was about a series of home invasions that had happened in the Riverside district around the same time as Helen's death. Break-ins mostly. A few had turned violent when the homeowners had been present. The suspect had never been caught, and the cases had eventually gone cold until 5 years ago. James scanned the report. They'd finally arrested someone for those break-ins. A guy named Kevin Porter, drug addict, history of theft and assault. He'd been caught during a burglary in 2020 and had eventually confessed to a dozen similar crimes from years earlier. He was currently serving 15 years upstate. James felt something twist in his stomach, something he couldn't quite name yet. He looked at the dates of Porter's crimes. Several had occurred within weeks of Helen's death, all in the same general area, all involving forced entry. He pulled up the photos from Porter's confirmed break-ins on the computer system, clicked through them one by one. Front doors with damaged locks, scratches around the door frames where someone had used a tool to force their way in. Standard burglary stuff. Nothing unusual, except James pulled up the photo of Helen's door lock again, placed it side by side with one of Porter's crime scenes on his screen. The pattern was identical. The same type of scratches, the same angle of force, the same method of entry. His mouth went dry. No, he thought. No, this doesn't mean anything. Lots of people break locks the same way. It's not exactly a unique skill. But his hands were already moving, pulling more files, comparing more photos. Porter had lived 4 blocks from the Riverside apartments, had been active in that exact neighborhood during that exact time period, had a pattern of escalating violence when his burglaries were interrupted by homeowners. James sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. His heart was pounding now. This couldn't be happening. They'd had the right guy. Tommy Ross had motive, opportunity, history. The evidence had been clear. The jury had agreed. 8 years. Tommy had been locked up for 8 years, but what if? No. James shook his head, tried to clear his thoughts. This was just coincidence. Porter had never been connected to Helen's case because there was no reason to connect him. They'd had their suspect. They'd had their conviction. This was just his mind playing tricks, finding patterns where none existed except he couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He'd built a career on trusting his instincts, and right now every instinct was screaming at him. He spent the rest of the afternoon digging through Porter's case files, reading arrest reports, interview transcripts, everything he could find. Porter had never been questioned about Helen's death. Why would he have been? By the time they caught him in 2020, Tommy Ross had already been in prison for 3 years. Case closed. James found himself reading through the original investigation file on Helen's case, looking at it with fresh eyes. The security footage that showed someone who looked like Tommy entering the building. But was it definitely him? The image was grainy. The person's face was partially hidden by a baseball cap. At the time, James had been certain. Now staring at the frozen image, he felt doubt creeping in. There'd been no physical evidence tying Tommy to the crime scene. No fingerprints. No DNA. Nothing definitive. Just circumstantial evidence that all seemed to point in one direction. A direction James had been so sure was right. He sat there in the basement archive room until well past 6 o'clock, until someone from building maintenance came down and asked if he was planning to stay all night. James gathered up the files, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do next, and the thought of it made him feel sick. He drove home in silence, didn't turn on the radio like he usually did. His wife asked him how his day was. He said fine, just fine, but she knew him well enough to see through it. She asked if something was wrong. He said he was just tired. Not quite a lie, but not quite the truth either. That night, James barely slept. He kept seeing Tommy's face at the sentencing, the way he'd looked at James and said, "I didn't do it." At the time, James had dismissed it. They all said that. Every criminal claimed innocence even when caught red-handed. But now those words echoed in his head. The next morning, James went straight to the evidence room. He needed to know. Had to be sure. There was one way to settle this. One way to prove he was just being paranoid. That his imagination was running away with him. DNA evidence from Helen's apartment had been collected 8 years ago. Samples that couldn't be identified at the time because they didn't match Tommy or Helen or anyone else in the system. At the trial, the prosecution had argued they were probably from previous visitors to the apartment. Nothing significant. Nothing that changed the overall picture of what had happened. James put in a request to have those samples compared against Kevin Porter's DNA. The request would raise questions. Would require approval. Would mean explaining why he was reopening a closed case. But he had to know. The not knowing was worse than any answer could be. The approval came through 3 days later. The comparison would take time, maybe a few weeks. James went through the motions of his regular work, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept thinking about Tommy Ross sitting in a prison cell. Kept thinking about Lily, now a teenager who'd grown up believing her mother's killer was behind bars. What if he'd been wrong? What if his certainty, his trust in the evidence, his instincts that had served him so well for so long had failed him when it mattered most? The call came on a Thursday afternoon. James was in his car, had just finished interviewing a witness for an unrelated case. He saw the number from the forensics lab and his hand shook slightly as he answered. The DNA was a match. Kevin Porter had been in Helen Wright's apartment the night she died. James sat there in his parked car, phone pressed to his ear, feeling like the world had just tilted on its axis. The forensics tech was still talking, saying something about the confidence level of the match, about next steps, about protocol. James barely heard any of it. 8 years. An innocent man had spent 8 years in prison because James had been so sure, so absolutely certain he was right. James sat in his car for over an hour after that phone call. Just sat there in the parking lot staring at nothing, trying to process what he'd just learned. People walked past. Life continued around him like normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. Nothing would ever feel normal again. An innocent man was in prison. Because of him. Because he'd been so sure, so confident in his reading of the evidence. Because he'd testified under oath and convinced a jury that Tommy Ross was guilty. Because he'd looked Helen's sister in the eye and promised her that justice had been served. He thought about calling his wife. Thought about driving home and pretending this wasn't happening. Thought about a dozen ways to avoid what came next. But there was only one right thing to do. And James had spent his entire career trying to do the right thing. He couldn't stop now just because it was going to destroy him. He drove back to the precinct and went straight to his captain's office. Captain Rodriguez had been with the department for 30 years. She'd seen everything, handled every kind of crisis. But when James told her about the DNA match, about Kevin Porter, about what it meant for Tommy Ross's conviction, even she looked shaken. "You're absolutely certain about this?" she asked, though they both knew he wouldn't be in her office if he wasn't. The forensics team confirmed it. Porter's DNA was at the scene. His method of breaking in matches perfectly. He was active in that area at that exact time. "We never looked at him because we already had Tommy." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and started making calls. Within an hour, James was in a conference room with the captain, the district attorney, and 2 lawyers from the public defender's office. The exoneration process had begun, but process was just a word for paperwork and procedures. It didn't capture what it felt like to sit in those meetings, explaining over and over how the investigation had gone wrong, how tunnel vision had set in once they'd identified Tommy as a suspect, how every piece of evidence had been interpreted through that lens, how nobody had questioned whether they might be wrong because everything seemed to fit so perfectly. The department launched an internal review. James's case files were pulled and examined. His other convictions were scrutinized. The media got wind of the story and descended like sharks smelling blood in the water. Wrongful conviction after 8 years screamed the headlines. Innocent man's life destroyed by police mistake. James cooperated with everything, answered every question, accepted responsibility. His captain tried to shield him, reminded everyone that he'd been following the evidence as he understood it, that wrongful convictions happened even in the best departments, that one mistake didn't erase 15 years of good work, but James knew better. This wasn't about statistics or department procedures. This was about Tommy Ross, who'd spent 8 years locked in a cage for something he didn't do. 8 years of his life gone, and it was James's fault. The exoneration process took 6 months. 6 months of legal motions and hearings and reviews. 6 months of James going through the motions at work while feeling like a ghost. 6 months of barely sleeping, of his wife asking him to talk to someone, of staring at his own reflection and not recognizing the person looking back. His marriage started to crack under the weight of it. His wife tried to be supportive, tried to tell him that he'd done the right thing by coming forward, that he couldn't have known. But James pulled away from her. He pulled away from everyone. How could he expect comfort when he'd destroyed someone's life? He attended every court hearing, sat in the back row and watched as lawyers argued about evidence and procedure, watched as Tommy's conviction was officially overturned, watched as the judge apologized as if an apology could give back 8 years. The day of Tommy's release, James went to the courthouse even though nobody expected him to be there. Even though his captain had suggested maybe he should stay away. He needed to see it, needed to face what he'd done. It was a media circus. Reporters everywhere, cameras, microphones. Tommy's mother was there, looking older than James remembered. The lawyer from the Innocence Project who'd taken on the case. A small crowd of supporters. And then Tommy walked out. He was 41 now, but he looked 50. Prison had aged him in ways that went deeper than just physical appearance. He'd gone in as a man still young enough to start over. He was coming out broken in ways that couldn't be measured. Tommy stood on the courthouse steps, blinking in the bright sunlight. His mother hugged him, crying. The lawyer spoke to the press about justice delayed and systemic problems. And Tommy just stood there looking lost in a world that had moved on without him. James stood at the edge of the crowd. He'd written a letter, apologizing, trying to explain, knowing nothing he said could make it right. The letter was in his pocket. He'd planned to give it to Tommy, to say the words out loud, to take responsibility face to face. But then Tommy's eyes found his across the crowd. They stared at each other for a long moment. James saw everything in that look. The anger, the betrayal, the years stolen, the life destroyed. Tommy didn't say anything. Didn't have to. His expression said it all. James pulled out the letter, took a step forward. But Tommy turned away, deliberately, completely, as if James didn't exist, as if he wasn't even worth acknowledging. And somehow that was worse than any words could have been. The crowd swallowed Tommy up. His mother led him to a waiting car. The cameras followed, and James stood there holding an envelope full of words that would never be read. He tried 3 more times to reach out, called the number Tommy's lawyer provided, sent the letter anyway, showed up at the apartment where Tommy was staying with his mother. Each time, nothing. Tommy wanted no contact, no apology, no explanation. The lawyer finally called James and told him to stop. That Tommy was trying to rebuild his life and James's presence was making it harder. James learned through mutual acquaintances that Tommy was struggling. He couldn't hold down a job, couldn't sleep through the night, couldn't adjust to a world that had changed completely while he'd been locked away. His girlfriend from before prison had married someone else. His friends had moved on. He'd lost everything, and no amount of state compensation could give it back. Meanwhile, Kevin Porter sat in prison for his other crimes, but he'd never be formally charged with Helen's death. He'd died of a drug overdose 6 months after the DNA match was confirmed, so there would be no trial, no additional sentence, no closure for Helen's family. Just the knowledge that the wrong man had been punished while the real killer had remained free for years. Helen's sister released a statement through her lawyer. She didn't blame James directly, but she talked about how they'd spent 8 years believing justice had been served, that Helen could rest in peace. Now they had to live with knowing the truth had been hidden all along, that Lily had grown up believing her mother's killer was behind bars when he'd actually been walking free. James submitted his resignation 4 times. Each time, Captain Rodriguez refused to accept it. "You made a mistake," she said. "A terrible mistake. But you also did the right thing when you discovered it." Running away now doesn't help anyone, but James wasn't sure he agreed. He stayed on the force because he didn't know what else to do, but everything had changed. The confidence that had made him a good detective was gone. He second-guessed every decision, questioned every assumption, saw doubt everywhere he'd once seen certainty. Some of the other detectives were supportive. Others whispered that James had lost his edge, that he couldn't be trusted on important cases anymore. The department kept him on, but he could feel the shift. He'd become the cautionary tale, the example of what happens when you get too sure of yourself. James started seeing a therapist, went twice a week and talked about guilt and responsibility, and how to live with causing irreparable harm. The therapist used words like trauma and healing. James let her talk, but he knew the truth. This wasn't trauma. This was consequence. This was what happened when you held someone's life in your hands and crushed it through your own certainty. At night, he still barely slept. He'd lie awake thinking about Tommy in a prison cell, counting the days, the months, the years, thinking about all the moments Tommy had missed, all the experiences stolen, all the damage that could never be undone. And he'd think about that night 8 years ago, about how sure he'd been, about how all the evidence had seemed to point in one direction, about how easy it had been to believe he was right. 3 years passed after Tommy's release. 3 years of James living in a world that looked the same but felt completely different. He stayed on the force, though part of him still believed he should have walked away. His captain had been right about one thing. Running wouldn't have helped anyone, but staying meant carrying the weight of what he'd done every single day. The job changed for him. Everything about it changed. Where he'd once moved through investigations with confidence, now he questioned everything. Every witness statement got triple-checked. Every piece of evidence got examined from multiple angles. Every conclusion got challenged and re-challenged before he'd commit to it. Some of his colleagues said he'd become too cautious, that he'd lost the instinct that made him a good detective. Maybe they were right. But James would rather be too careful than too certain. Certainty was what had put an innocent man in prison. His marriage didn't survive. His wife tried, she really did. But James had pulled so far into himself that there was nothing left for her to hold on to. They separated quietly. No drama. Just a sad acknowledgement that the man she'd married wasn't the same person anymore. She told him she hoped he'd find peace someday. He told her he didn't deserve it. He moved into a small apartment downtown. Kept working. Kept going through the motions. On his days off, he'd sometimes drive past the Riverside apartments. The building looked the same. New tenants had moved into Helen's old apartment years ago. Life had moved on for everyone except the people whose lives had been destroyed that November night. James heard things about Tommy through the grapevine. Nothing direct, just bits and pieces that people mentioned without knowing how deeply James cared. Tommy had moved to another state, somewhere in the Midwest, trying to start fresh where nobody knew his story. He was working construction, someone said. Or maybe it was warehouse work. The details were always fuzzy. What wasn't fuzzy was that Tommy was struggling. The years in prison had left scars that weren't visible on the outside. Trust issues, anger problems, difficulty connecting with people. The state had given him compensation, a check that was supposed to somehow balance the scales for 8 years of his life. But money couldn't fix what prison had broken. James thought about Tommy constantly, wondered if he was okay, wondered if he'd found any kind of peace or happiness, wondered if the anger had faded or if it burned as hot as ever. He'd stopped trying to reach out. Tommy had made it clear he wanted nothing to do with James, and James had to respect that. It was the very least he could do. One afternoon, James was having lunch at a diner near the precinct when he saw Lily. He almost didn't recognize her. She was 16 now, taller, almost grown. She was with an older woman, probably her aunt, the one who'd taken her in after Helen died. They were laughing about something, and for a moment James just watched, glad to see that she seemed okay. Then Lily looked up and saw him. Her smile faded. She said something to her aunt, and they both looked his way. James felt frozen. He wanted to go over, to say something, to apologize for his part in everything that had gone wrong. But what could he possibly say? Lily's aunt put a hand on her shoulder and they left the diner quickly. James sat there staring at his half-eaten sandwich, appetite gone. Even that brief moment had been too much. His presence was just a reminder of the worst time in their lives. Later, he learned that Lily had found her voice again. Years of therapy had helped her process the trauma. She was doing well in school, had friends, was thinking about college, small victories that Helen would have been proud of. But Lily had also learned the truth about what happened that night, about Tommy's wrongful conviction, about how Kevin Porter had been the real killer all along. James wondered what she thought about it all. Whether she blamed him, whether she understood that he'd been trying to get justice for her mother, even if he'd gotten it catastrophically wrong, but he'd never know. Some questions didn't deserve answers. Work became the only constant in James's life. He threw himself into cases, worked longer hours than necessary, volunteered for the assignments nobody else wanted. His captain worried he was burning out, but James couldn't stop. The work was the only thing that made sense anymore. The only thing that felt like penance. He developed a reputation in the department. The detective who never made assumptions, who checked and rechecked everything, who'd rather let a case go cold than risk being wrong. Some younger officers looked up to him for his thoroughness. Others found him frustrating, too slow, too careful. James didn't care what anyone thought. He'd learned the hard way what happened when you moved too fast, trusted too much, believed too easily. On the 10-year anniversary of Helen's death, James drove out to the cemetery where she was buried. He'd never been there before, had always felt like he didn't have the right, but something pulled him there that day. He brought flowers, stood at her grave for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, though he knew it meant nothing. "I'm sorry I got it wrong. I'm sorry I was so sure. I'm sorry for all of it." The wind rustled through the trees. A few other people visited graves nearby, lost in their own grief. James stood there until his legs ached, trying to find words that didn't exist for what he needed to say. He thought about the version of himself from 10 years ago. That confident detective who'd walked into Helen's apartment and thought he knew exactly what had happened. Who'd built a case on circumstantial evidence and called it justice. Who'd looked into Tommy's eyes and seen guilt where there was only innocence. That person felt like a stranger now. James barely recognized him. The certainty was gone. The confidence was gone. All that remained was doubt and the knowledge that he'd have to carry this weight for the rest of his life. Sometimes people asked him if he regretted staying on the force. If it was too hard working as a detective after what happened. The truth was, leaving would have been easier. Walking away, starting over somewhere new, trying to forget. But James didn't want easy. He didn't deserve easy. He stayed because maybe, just maybe, by being more careful now, by questioning everything, by never letting certainty cloud his judgment again, he could keep this from happening to someone else. He couldn't undo what he'd done to Tommy, couldn't give back those 8 years, couldn't make it right. But he could try to make sure no other innocent person lost their life because a detective was too sure of himself. On his worst days, James still drove past the Riverside apartments. Still thought about that November night. Still remembered finding Lily in the corner, silent and shaking. Still felt the weight of every decision he'd made afterward. The building looked different now. They'd renovated it, painted it a different color. New people lived there, with their own lives and problems and stories. None of them knew what had happened in apartment 4B. Time had moved on. The world had moved on, but James carried it with him everywhere he went. In the careful way he approached every case. In the questions he asked that other detectives didn't think to ask. In the doubt that lived permanently in the back of his mind, whispering that he might be wrong, that he might be missing something. That certainty was the enemy of truth. He heard one more thing about Tommy, about 2 years after his release. Someone mentioned that he'd met someone, was in a relationship, seemed to be doing a bit better. James didn't know if it was true or just wishful thinking from people who wanted a happy ending to an impossible story. He hoped it was true. Hoped that Tommy had found some measure of peace, some way to build a life from the ruins. Hoped that the anger had faded enough to let some light back in. Hoped that somehow, someday, Tommy could be more than just the man who lost 8 years to someone else's mistake. As for James, he knew his story didn't get a happy ending. This was his life now, The guilt, the doubt, the weight of knowing he'd destroyed an innocent man's life. He'd learned to live with it the way you learn to live with chronic pain. It never really goes away. You just get used to carrying it. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, James still thought about that moment in the courthouse when Tommy's eyes had met his across the crowd. The look that said more than words ever could. The look that James would carry with him until the day he died. Some mistakes you make can be fixed. Some wrongs can be made right. But some things, once broken, stay broken forever. James had learned that the hardest way possible, and he'd spend the rest of his life making sure he never forgot it.